It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Marguerite Nguyen. Professor Nguyen specializes in 20th to 21st century American and Asian American literature. And among her many interests, Professor Nguyen has written about the dynamics of race, migration, the empire, environment, and Southeast Asian American cultures of Louisiana. In the past decade, she's also written extensively about the refugee and diasporic experiences and representation. She's the author of America's Vietnam, the long durée of US literature and empire, and also a co-editor of Refugee Cultures 40 years after the Vietnam War. And her next project, Refugee Ecologies, interprets American literature as a practice of world building in context of disaster and displacement, particularly as depicted by writers of color. Today's lecture will also introduce you to some of the main topics in critical refugee studies. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nguyen.
Thank you so much. That was such a nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I just wanted to thank Dr. Ree for inviting me to be a part of this lecture series. I'm always interested in hearing what people have to say about Asian American literary studies, especially outside of the U.S. context. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing your comments. And then also thank you to Dr. Shin for arranging all the practical logistical aspects of this talk. I know that involves a lot of labor, so I really appreciate that. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started, but I have not done a Zoom lecture in a really long time, so let me figure out if I can remember how to share my screen. Let's see. Can I share a screen?
Let me shortly make you the co-host. I think it requires that.
I see.
So how do I do this? Yep.
Great.
There we go.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Okay, great. Let me make sure I can see my own PowerPoint. Okay, so the title of my talk is Asian American Literature and the Emergence of Critical Refugee Studies. My name is Marguerite Nguyen, and I am Associate Professor of English at Wesleyan University, and I'm also affiliated with the College of the Environment and the College of East Asian Studies at Wesleyan. We are a small liberal arts college, so we've got about 3,000 undergraduate students. We're very research heavy and teaching heavy. In Connecticut, where we are in Connecticut, is about 2.5 hours outside of New York City. If you're wondering where in the world Wesleyan University is. I also listed my email contact information in case anybody would like to contact me. I would love to hear from you all. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief introduction to myself, basically, what I research, what I teach, and very briefly what the field of critical refugee studies is. And then I will go into more depth about the emergence of critical refugee studies within Asian American studies. And basically, it kind of evolved because of some oversights or blind spots that some scholars were picking up on in the field of Asian American studies. And then I will move to my approach to the field, which is currently oriented around the idea of refugee ecology. So I'm very much interested in the relationship between refugees and the environment. And then we can turn to some questions and discussion, where I will look forward to hearing more about your own research and teaching interest. In terms of research, I work primarily in Asian American literature and Vietnamese diasporic literature. So I think a lot about, how do we define these fields? How do different people approach these topics? Some people, focus more on the American context. Some folks like to bring in more of an Asian regional dimension into the field. So I'm just very interested in the different ways that people approach these topics. and how they're kind of always in flux and always being redefined. I'm really drawn to what the literary qualities of these areas of study are, as well as their historical context. So probably like many of you, I'm really fascinated by how writers kind of translate, historical experiences into literary form. And of course, I also work in critical refugee studies, which is a relatively new field. And this field, as you know, because you read Espiritu's essay, mainly focuses on refugees and their stories as sources of important critique. So the field really grows out of a concern for the way that refugees are being depicted, not only in the news, but also by some scholars as kind of passive objects of study who don't seem to have a vibrant life of their own. And critical refugee studies tries to counteract that. I think scholars in the field who are working on the literary dimensions have done some very interesting work in terms of reinterpreting Asian American literature and also world literature more broadly as a refugee literature. So as I will get into in a little bit, Asian American studies paradigms still in some ways revolve around themes like immigration and the model minority myth. And critical refugee studies tries to kind of shift the balance a little bit to bring attention to aspects of forced displacement that characterize the literature. I also have some side interests in Vietnamese studies and archives. I really love old books and documents. And I'm also interested in eco-criticism or the environmental humanities. Some courses that I teach, I thought it would be useful to share because I'm also constantly sort of thinking about how to relate research and teaching. And I'm sure some of you think about this too, but how do we kind of communicate complex intellectual ideas to diverse students? So some of the courses that I teach include Introduction to Asian American Literature, Vietnam War Literature and Film, Refugee Literature, and I've been kind of starting to play around with the new topic, Asian American young adult literature. And I started doing this in response to students who have become very interested in this topic. And I think for them, they think a lot of Asian American literature is full of trauma and suffering and hardship. And they're kind of like, where do I find the joy and the creativity? And I think a lot of them are finding it in young adult literature. So that's something that I've begun to explore a little bit more. So I thought I would start with some kind of basic information and facts about refugees, just to give you an idea of how prominent and important refugee issues are in our world today. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR for short, was established in 1950 to deal with large-scale human migrations during and after World War II. And it was established as a very Europe-centered organization. So at the time, if you were a European migrating from Europe, you would be considered for refugee status, which means that if you no longer have the protection of your home country, you're basically a stateless person and you're forced to flee your home. If you are recognized as a refugee, you can become considered for resettlement in a new country and then become entitled to the rights and resources of your new home country. But it was very Europe-centered at the time. So if you were from Africa or Asia, forced to flee your home in the mid-century, you would not be considered for refugee status. And that did not come until later. So I think that's a very important point to make. But in any case, in the 1950s, the UNHCR was established and it defined who a refugee was. And that definition of refugee is still the definition that we abide by today. It's still a definition that officials use when they're trying to determine whether or not a person who is seeking asylum deserves refugee status. So according to the United Nations, a refugee is basically somebody who is forced to flee across international borders because they fear persecution based on one of these 5 factors. race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So if a person could prove that they've been persecuted and will be persecuted for one of those 5 reasons in their home country, they can become eligible for refugee status. So currently, there are over 117 million forcibly displaced people in the world. Out of that number, 31,600,000 are classified as refugees, and that number keeps like going up every single day. Every time I check it, it just bumps up. And this is a change actually in the United Nations missions, because just a few years ago, they were hoping to eliminate refugees, but that's no longer plausible. And so they've shifted their perspective and have basically kind of tried to figure out how can we actually solve refugee situations. The only way to do that is to really get rid of conditions and war and conflict. So it's basically, the point is there are a lot of refugees in the world. So I think that what, critical refugee studies sort of works from is the idea that refugees are a central aspect of contemporary existence. They're not going away. The refugees are not necessarily these sort of outsider figures who are refugees one day, and then once they get resettled are no longer refugees. We are just going to have more and more refugees. And what that also means is that the conditions of war and violence that produce refugees are also aspects of our daily lives that we have to kind of think about. I don't know if any of you have read Viet Thanh Nguyen's work, but he's the author of The Sympathizer that was just made into a big budget HBO series. But in 2016, he made an observation that if refugees formed their own country, it would be the world's 24th largest country. And that was an observation made in 2016, so most likely that country would be even bigger today. There is actually a refugee Olympic team that competes at the Olympics, so that's something that's, I think, very interesting. And the prominence of refugees in the world, and especially in the 20th century onward, has led many political theorists to argue that we have to start thinking about how to organize our politics using the refugee as the starting point. So we are very much used to thinking about how we kind of live our day-to-day lives in our countries in terms of citizenship, right? So, many of us, not all of us, but many of us enjoy or have a passport that says we are citizens of a certain country. So we have the rights and resources of that country that is supposed to protect us. But theorists like Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben, I don't know if some of you are interested in them, but these political thinkers argue that's kind of not the right way to think about it. We have to kind of shift the way we think about it and actually foreground the refugee, because the refugee kind of marks the limit point of the ability of a nation to protect its citizens. So they argue that we have to think about the future in terms of the refugee. And how does politics sort of relate to literature? I think what this means is that in the future, the refugee will become more and more a central protagonist of literary works. And I think that you already are beginning to see a lot of this. There are a lot of refugee writers, way more than I could ever list in a PowerPoint slide, but these are just a few that I think have received a lot of recognition in recent years, and they're all really very interesting works of literature worth checking out, just as good works of literature. But Marjane Satrapi is a French-Iranian graphic narrative artist, and Persepolis is an autobiographical narrative of her journey from Iran and the experiences of being a refugee. Lots of awards, was made into a movie that also received lots of awards. Viet Thanh Nguyen is author of The Sympathizer, won the American Pulitzer Prize in 2016. And again, I think that HBO series is streaming right now, if anybody wants to check it out. And Abdulrazak Gurna, a writer from Zanzibar, also very interested in refugee issues, is a really fantastic writer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2021. So this is just a sampling of some writers who I think are reflective of that idea that the refugee is going to become an increasingly important protagonist in literature around the world. Okay, so now I'm going to move to how critical refugee studies emerged from within Asian American studies. And before I do that, just some really quick facts about the Vietnam War, because I think that these losses and these forms of destruction are things that Nguyen Le Espiritu was trying to grapple with when she decided to articulate this field of critical refugee studies. So the Vietnam War, which roughly spanned the 1950s or 1960s, depending on who you ask, through 1975, was a war that killed 6 million people, 6 million Southeast Asians. That's not counting, the people who might have died during the boat migrations. It's not counting the people who might have died very slow deaths from chemical warfare. But in the immediate wartime years, about 6 million Southeast Asians died. 7.5 million tons of bombs were dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia during the war. And this was twice as much as was used in Europe and Asia during World War II. And also a distinctive factor was the use of herbicides, 19 million gallons of herbicides used in Southeast Asia. Much of that was Agent Orange. And I put herbicides in quotes because the companies that produce those chemicals refused to acknowledge that they were used as chemical warfare. So just some information about the war, because I think that these things are very important to Espiritu in terms of the kind of human loss of life and environmental loss of life that she's really trying to kind of work with. So Espiritu in 2006 articulates the field of critical refugee studies, and it is described in an essay that she writes for the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, again, published in 2006. And the title of that essay, if you're interested in the kind of earlier, more extended version of the field, is toward a critical refugee study, the Vietnamese refugee subject in US scholarship. And here, she's really taking issue with the way that Vietnamese refugees specifically, but also forcibly displaced people more broadly, are depicted in the news, depicted by politicians, and also just depicted in a lot of scholarship at the time, where often what you see when you see refugees depicted at all are large groups of people who, kind of are not individuals. They're sort of faceless masses of people. You don't really hear much about them or from them, except that they're very desperate. They might be very hungry, they might be starving, they might be dehydrated. These images are actually from the news program that I mentioned in my essay on page 222. It's the 60 Minutes episode. 60 Minutes is like this news program in the US devoted to Vietnamese boat people migrations in the late 1970s. And so one of the journalists sort of went out to various Southeast Asian countries and sort of like had his binoculars and like looked out for Vietnamese refugees, Southeast Asian refugees. But some of these narratives were very diminishing because everybody would have known that these refugees were on the waters at that time, but anytime it was covered in the news, people acted like it was a big surprise. Like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden there are these Southeast Asian refugees on the waters. How did they get there, right? So Espiritu is really annoyed, at these representations because they're dehumanizing. And the depictions sort of strip refugees of their own histories, their own politics, and their own cultures. And it's a very weird thing to do because it's not like once refugees move, that they lose all of that stuff. Even if they're just struggling to survive, they still carry with them very complicated stories, very complicated histories and politics. And you fast forward to the 2000s, and a lot hasn't changed, actually. Like if you see refugees depicted in the news today, and today most of the coverage is of, say, like the US-Mexico border, or refugees crossing the Mediterranean Sea from Africa and Asia, you see a lot of the same patterns. So again, lots of people sort of crowded into these boats. A lot of these boats are very unstable, and you don't really get much context into the people themselves or the reasons why they're forced to migrate. So for Espiritu, she argues, as you saw in the essay, that refugees are depicted often as passive objects of study. We study refugees, we investigate these objects, or they're objects of pity. They're often seen as desperate, they're in need of aid, and it's like they don't have a history, politics, or culture of their own. And for Espiritu, who is trained as an Asian Americanist in sociology, had initially believed that, well, Asian American studies will be the natural intellectual home for raising these issues, right? Because Asian American studies is committed to highlighting any and all issues related to Asian Americans and the Asian diasporas. But Espiritu finds that she is, quote, disheartened that Vietnamese lives, histories, and politics continue to be peripheral to the field of Asian American studies. And this is a quote that I pulled from page 2. So basically, she thought she would have a space for examining Southeast Asian refugee issues in the field of Asian American studies, and that turned out not to be the case. So what is also curious to Espiritu about this problem within Asian American studies, excuse me, is that the Asian American movement of the 1960s and 1970s that ultimately led to the establishment of Asian American studies in the university was significantly shaped by the Vietnam War. So this is a little refresher of the origins of Asian American studies. Asian Americans in the 1960s, part of their activism was an identification with the Vietnamese because they felt like there were shared concerns. So we're Asian Americans experiencing violence and racism and American empire. Vietnamese are also experiencing those same things. So there's a natural kind of connection between these two groups, right? And so it's even stranger for Espiritu that the movement would have been so based on the Vietnam War, yet the field itself had very little to say about Southeast Asians and their histories. So they did not seriously engage, with the topics that Espiritu wanted to bring to the foreground. And this is an image I pulled that kind of exemplifies that. This is a picture of Asian American activists in the 1960s protesting in the streets of the Bay Area. And you can see just from their signs that they are calling for an end to the war, stop the bombing of Asian people, stop Asian genocide. And so you see that kind of identification that Asian Americans are forging with Vietnamese, but there doesn't seem to be much awareness of the complexity of the war itself. So, the war is not just a war of the US versus Vietnam, it's actually a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And it involves not only the United States, but it also involves China and the Soviet Union and a lot of regional dynamics. So all of that becomes lost in the language of the Asian American movement. And that just sort of speaks to what Espiritu argues is Asian American studies' larger neglect of Southeast Asian and Southeast Asian diasporic issues. And so this graphic would seem to show or prove that that imbalance continues. So this is a graphic I pulled from an article by Long Lecoq and Kate Howe called The Asian American Literature We've Constructed. And what they basically did was analyze a bunch of data on conference presentations, essays being published in the field of Asian American literary studies. And what they found was that 80% of the scholarship in Asian American literary studies is very East Asian American focused. In other words, focuses on Chinese, Japanese, and Korean American literature. And so all of these other ethnic groups are much lower in the scale. So it's a very interesting finding, and sort of they kind of come to the same conclusion that Espiritu would come to, which is, why is there such an imbalance in the field? How do we kind of shift it just to make sure that the field is not kind of replicating its own exclusions and own marginalizations? So for Espiritu, as you read in her article on critical refugee studies, to me, it's a very kind of bold thing to define a new field. Like, I think that's a very hard and challenging thing to do. But this is, I think, what Espiritu is trying to do at this time, which is define a critical refugee studies approach to Asian American studies. And for her, What that would mean is to center refugees and refugee narratives, to focus on issues of colonialism, war, and displacement. And this would be a little bit different from some of the more conventional models of Asian American literary criticism, which tend to center around issues like immigration or the model minority myth. And often what those kinds of approaches do is focus more on leaving a homeland to find better economic opportunity, the struggles of assimilation, the struggles of being a model minority. And what you could lose when you focus on those things are these other issues of empire and war, the violence of war, and how that leads to forced displacement. Also, with critical refugee studies, even though it emerges from within the field of Asian American studies, it does expand beyond it. And I think that is a very exciting part of the field because it communicates the idea that, Asian American literary studies, for example, has a lot to say, not only to literary scholars or Asian American studies scholars, but also to multiple other fields beyond Asian American studies. Okay, so I'm going to shift now to my approach, which is I currently think about as refugee ecologies. So let me give you a brief autobiographical blurb. I think in hindsight, I've always been very interested in the relationship between refugees and the environment, because my parents, who were Vietnam War refugees, when they told me stories about their refugee journey, it was always so tightly tied to the water, and the water was always a political space in their stories. So my father was in the South Vietnamese military, and when it became clear that South Vietnam was going to dissolve and Vietnam was going to be reunited under a communist regime, my parents tried to figure out how to get out of the country. And the way that they got out was they went on a South Korean commercial ship that was commissioned by the US that had been docked right outside of Saigon. And so that ship basically would take off once they got permission to go. And so they left Saigon, which is like right here, made a stop in Guam. Guam is very hard to find on a map. If you want to look for it, you have to search really hard and like really focus in on a map to find Guam, the American territory. And then they made a stop in Hawaii, and then were sponsored by an Episcopalian church, one of the oldest Episcopalian churches in Virginia Beach. So this is their journey, and I was born in Virginia. So I think I was always just kind of fascinated by the kinds of journeys that refugees make, the way that these journeys often involve dangerous travels by water. And in this case, their journey completely followed the trail of American military bases. So all of these stops were stops where there were American military bases. So again, water is not an apolitical space. It's not an ahistorical space. It's an incredibly political space, but you will not always see this in prominent depictions or dominant depictions of refugees and the environment. Often I think that in these more mainstream representations, there's this idea that water is just like this natural element and it's very dangerous, rather than a kind of economic and political thoroughfare. And so I think that that is how I approach critical refugee studies, not only to kind of bring refugees into the center, but think about how they rewrite the environment so that they inject a dynamic and evolving history, politics, and culture into the story of refugees. So again, sort of summarizing my approach, I'm interested in how refugees are depicted in relation to the environment, how depictions of the environment shape who we think is or is not a refugee. So the way that refugees are depicted in relationship to whatever it is, like water, land, the shore, whatever, is incredibly strategic. And politicians and the United Nations when they are representing forcibly displaced people, it's all very tactical. And so it's, I think, very important to think about, okay, so does a certain depiction of a forcibly displaced population elicit understanding and inclusion and compassion, or does it elicit feelings of fear and exclusion? And I think the environment has a lot to do with those responses. Namla's the boat. I don't want to go through all the details of the story because you read my essay, so it's all in there. But just to kind of summarize, I think that the boat does a really effective job of centering refugee protagonists and refugee stories. So the whole story is unusual in that it is basically the story of a 13-day refugee boat journey. The boat journey is not depicted as just like one part of a person's, larger arc of life, but it's really the story. And so the boat foregrounds the refugee story as the story to tell. It also, I think, elaborates on the conditions of war and violence that create refugees. So you get scenes where, people have to understand the changing political borders that happen anytime that you have a war. The scenes with the re-education camp, I think, are really important in depicting how war and war violence are unresolved, and how the father's experience drive him to tell his daughter that she must leave the country. So I think it does a good job of elaborating on that. And I think the boat reimagines water in really significant ways to portray refugees as sources of historical, political, and spiritual knowledge rather than as passive objects of pity or of investigation. So for example, you get areas where we're exposed to deep Vietnamese maritime history and skills. So these are not just people who randomly, jump in the water and hope that they make it somewhere, but they, the captain of the ship, Anh Phuoc, is incredibly knowledgeable about the water, and he has very deep maritime skills. And I think that is really important because you sort of lose that in a lot of refugee depictions. The Vietnamese folk song that comes into play several times in the story, I think, is also really important. This is an 18th century Vietnamese song that relates Vietnamese spirituality and cosmology as it has evolved over time. So I think that Nam Le's use of that song connects more recent experiences of forced migration to past experiences of forced migration. And then I think that what that allows the story to do is to trace a story or a genealogy of Vietnamese diaspora from a refugee's point of view. And that is a big goal of critical refugee studies, is to encourage refugees to tell their stories on their own terms. And one insight that I found particularly moving about the boat is the way that it depicts how injury inflicted on refugees becomes an injury inflicted on the earth. So you have all these really interesting moments where nature, whether that's like the water or wind, kind of merges with humans, with the refugees. And so they start to take on qualities of one another. And I think those moments are really interesting because they kind of communicate the scale of every single instance of refugee injury, that it really impacts the globe. And so I think that's important. And it also sort of calls upon the audience to reflect on their relationship to the scale of refugee migrations and refugee losses. One little note I wanted to make was that the boat was translated into Vietnamese. It's written in English. It's translated into Vietnamese, published in Vietnam, but it was censored. And so the scenes about the re-education camp and also some of the scenes related to the boat journey are cut out. And so that's something that I find to be very interesting also. So I'm going to start closing the lecture. I don't want to lose you all. I know once you hit a certain point, everybody starts to kind of tune out. But I wanted to start closing by mentioning these two quotes by refugee writers. So Chris Abani is a Nigerian writer. And he says, quote, "America is not really a nation of immigrants, but rather of refugees. Trauma, displacement, and a fanatical hope have marked all Americans from the occupation of the Mayflower through every subsequent group who arrived or were forcibly brought here." And And then the other quote is from Abdulrazak Gurnah, who was the 2021 Nobel Prize winner for literature. The refugee has always been, quote, right there, grinning through the canon for centuries, unquote. So what I think these two writers are saying is that the refugee figure has been marginalized in literary analysis and in literary history, but they've always been there. And so what would happen if we kind of rethink the way that we have categorized national literatures and foreground the figure of the refugee in literature? It would sort of cause, it might rehaul the way that we think about a lot of literary works. So I find those to be, two very provocative statements about how we could engage refugee literature more seriously. And then here, I just wanted to list or note some recent works in the field of critical refugee studies in case anybody's interested in looking further into this topic. This book, Departures, is a great, helpful introduction to critical refugee studies. Minor Salvage by Stephen Sohn is a book that I recently read and really admire because he's basically rereading Korean American literature as a refugee literature. Lived Refuge by Vinh Nguyen is a book that tries to categorize the different layers of experience of refugee subjects. So if anyone's interested, I recommend those books. But that's it. That's my presentation on critical refugee studies. I'm really happy to take questions if there's anything that's kind of either unclear or you want to take up further. I would love to chat about it. And then I do have a couple questions for, I think, discussion a little bit later.